Don't be embarrassed. Friendly. Thank you for joining us today for the departmental seminar series. I'm pleased to have a few minutes to introduce Dr. Todd Greffing from the University of Georgia, where he's currently an assistant professor. Prior to joining Georgia, I'll give you a little background on his education. So he got his bachelor's at Princeton, his PhD from the University of Maryland. He did postdocs at a couple of very prominent avian ecology labs, Smithsonian Institution in Patuxent. He was at Utah State for a number of years before now being back near home in Georgia. His research is very diverse in terms of species and topics. He'll talk about some of those today. He's been published fairly highly ranking journals like Ecology, PNAS, and Journal of Applied Ecology, where his work largely focuses on the movement and population dynamics of migratory birds, everything from painted buntings like you see here to white pelicans. And I'm really happy to be able to join us today.
Yeah, great. Thanks. It's really good to be here. See some old friends and meet some new people. Looking forward to meeting with grad students later. So I'm going to give kind of a diversity of topics that cover all kind of at the centering around the larger theme of my research program, which is combining new technological tools with new statistical methods. And it's kind of my pitch to grad students of like why we make you take so many statistics courses. And if you're anything like me, you got into this field because you really liked studying wildlife and being out in the field, and then all of a sudden you get to grad school and we're making you take statistics courses and learn to program and all that kind of stuff. And this is sort of my overview of why those topics are so important, especially as these new technological tools emerge and grow so rapidly. So as David mentioned, most of my work is focused on migratory birds. And because I started to study migratory birds, a lot of my work focuses on questions around movement and movement ecology and kind of the intersection of movement ecology and population ecology, which is hard to escape when you study birds that can migrate over thousands of kilometers every year. And this is a really exciting time to be working on these topics because over the last 10 to 15 years or so, advances in tracking technologies have led to the emergence of this new field of movement ecology. And if you're familiar with any of the work on this new field, you've probably seen figures like this, where we have these tracking devices now that we can put on wildlife, and they tell us really precisely where those individuals are at any given moment in time. And so we can track their movement paths, and we can learn about how and why they move and how that relates to behavior and these really basic questions about foraging ecology and habitat use and predator-prey dynamics and all of that sort of thing. And this works really well when you study these big species that you can, strap a car battery to their neck, and you can get location data every 2 minutes or something like that with GPS level precision. So if you go to movement ecology sessions at ESA or conferences like that, you tend to see these talks that are about wolves and elephants and sea turtles, and it's really fascinating, and it can be really overwhelming in terms of the statistical methods they use. But for somebody like me who studies little dinky birds like painted buntings, where this kind of movement ecology paradigm fits in has been somewhat challenging, because most migratory birds, the vast majority of migratory bird species, are too small to carry tags that are suited for that sort of detailed movement model. And that presents a lot of challenges. Now, that's not to say that we can't gather this type of data. Oh, excuse me, I was going to have to stop. Why does this matter? Many of you are probably familiar with this paper that came out in Science a few years ago, documenting the decline of North America's avifauna. So we've lost about 3 billion birds over the last 50 years or so, with most of those losses occurring in species that are migratory. So about 2.5 billion fewer migratory birds in North America than there were 50 years ago. And for the most part, we don't really know why most of these species are declining. There's some exceptions to that, but for the most part, for species like Baltimore orioles, or I'll mention a few others, Chuck-Will's widows and painted buntings, we know they're declining. We don't have a great sense of why or where the primary threats to those species occur, and that makes it really hard to implement management and conservation actions, which is why we've known about these declines for most of the last 50 years, and we haven't made a ton of progress on stopping them for new species. Now, many people have referred to this era as kind of the golden age of avian tracking, and that's because the tags are getting much smaller, so we can now track species that, just 10 or 15 years ago we couldn't. So as David mentioned, I was at Utah State for a number of years, and so I have some Western examples. This is a PhD student in my lab, Amy Van Tatenhove, who studies white pelicans. So let's hope the animation works. You see these little maps of pelicans with GPS transmitters attached to their back. And as they leave the American West and make their fall migration down to Mexico, one individual going to the eastern United States. So this is great. We can track birds like pelicans at this point with GPS level precision, and that's pretty good. White pelicans are one of the biggest species in North America. And so we can start to think of kind of their movement. This is another example of kind of emerging technology. Look, that map went a little schizophrenic. These tags are getting very small. So these are tracks from yellow-billed cuckoos. This is some work in collaboration with Callie Stanley, who's a postdoc at Georgetown, and Pete Mara, who's at Georgetown. So yellow-billed cuckoos are pretty small. These are 2-gram tags that we've been deploying on yellow-billed cuckoos for the last several years, giving us tracks of where birds from eastern and western North America migrate and spend the winter. And this is really great information. Western yellow-billed cuckoos are now listed as endangered. Eastern yellow-billed cuckoos are not doing much better. And what's really fascinating with this type of data is we can see almost all of these birds converge on this little small area, the Gran Chacos region in South America, highlighting that might be a region that's critically important for yellow-billed cuckoo conservation. Just a few more examples of the advances in tracking technology. Another project that came out of my time in Utah was studying pinion jays. If you've been out west, you may have been lucky enough to see pinion jays. This is another species that's being currently petitioned for listing on an endangered species list. They've declined by about 80% or more over the last 50 years. They're obligate pinyon juniper birds. They depend on those woodlands, and if you've ever been out west, you know that the land management agencies out there clear thousands and thousands of acres in juniper habitat to create habitat for sage grouse and mule deer and things like that. So we're interested in how pinion jays are responding to the large-scale manipulation of land out there. So we started putting, this is another PhD student, Hannah Wright, who's been putting these little 2-gram GPS tags, and these are the movements of pinion jays across the Colorado Plateau of Utah, and you can see they're making these really big movements. Without this type of tracking technology, we would never know that a bird that was spending at least a part of the year down here in southern Utah moved all the way up to central Utah. So we can learn about that. Another example, this is a new project that started in Georgia. I could talk the rest of the hour about Chuck-Will's widows. This is a species of nightjar. You probably heard him if you've been anywhere, in a wooded area in the southeast in the summertime. You probably heard Chuck-Will's widow singing. Another example of a species that has suffered from huge declines over the last 50 years, and nobody's really ever studied Chuck-Will's widows. They're very difficult to study. They're mostly nocturnal. During the day, they're extremely camouflaged. So we don't really know a lot about them. We certainly don't know anything about their migration routes, where they spend the winter, those types of questions. So this is a master's student, Natalie Ramos, I like to joke, find somebody who looks at you the way Natalie looks at this checklist widow. And we've been learning how to catch them and putting these little 1 gram GPS tags on them. We've gotten a little bit of tracking data back. This is data from one bird that was breeding in coastal Georgia. Spent a little bit of time in September and August north of this breeding site, migrated down, hugged the coast, jumped over and spent the winter in central Cuba. We've been testing out another kind of tag. This is a smaller tag that instead of giving us precise locations, it just pings off of a cell tower and then pings our phone and tells us what cell tower that bird was at. This is some fall migration data from one of these birds showing daily the way that it works its way down the coast. So we have, again, these kind of interesting movement ecology questions that are emerging. Why these coastal birds, are they mostly going to Cuba and the Caribbean, whereas birds that are up closer to Athens and the Piedmont, is this kind of migration around the Gulf more common, and what does that mean for their conservation and understanding their type? So this is great. We have these tags that are allowing us to gather new data on birds as small as, maybe 60 to 70 grams. Unfortunately, that leaves most of the avian diversity around the world still too small for those types of tags. This is the histogram of body mass. This paper is a little outdated now, so a lot of these lines showing different technologies have gotten smaller, but the point remains that most of the birds that we need this type of information for are too small to carry. So we have a lot of challenges left to understand the ecology of these species. We need technologies that allow us to track their movements. And the theme of this talk will mostly be, as these new technologies emerge, how do we make robust inference about their ecology from those tags? And oftentimes it's a bit more complicated than it seems on the surface. So I'm going to kind of highlight 3 projects that are going on in my lab, or at least one that's already finished. Thinking about how we estimate migratory connectivity from archival tags, and I'll explain what that means in just a minute. Then I'll talk about some current work estimating survival and migration phenology from automated telemetry networks. And then the last part is some new work we're starting thinking about these automated telemetry networks from the perspective of study design. How can we better design these networks to make the inferences that we want? So I'm going to start off talking about another one of my favorite birds, the painted bunting. We're in South Carolina. A lot of times I give these talks, and I was in Utah and I had to explain to people what painted buntings were and where they were. Many of you are probably familiar with them. At least the eastern population. This is a iconic songbird of the southeastern coast, declining as are most songbirds. So a number of years back, we started this project. This was a collaboration with Scott Sillett, who's a collaborator of mine at the Smithsonian, Viviana Ruiz, who's a collaborator at Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and then Andrew Sharp, who was a master's student of mine at Utah State, to try to figure out where these painted buntings that are breeding along the southeastern coast are spending the winter. We had 5 sampling sites that span their coastal breeding range, and we deployed these little archival tags. So this is what's called a light level geolocator. It's very small. These only weigh about 0.3 to 0.4 grams. The way they work is they have this little light stock on the back. That light stock every 5 minutes just records the intensity of ambient light. So that you get in theory, every 5 minutes, we just get a measure of how bright the light is where that bird is located. And the tags just store the data on board. So we deploy the tag in 1 year, we have to recatch the bird the next year. And if we recatch the bird and get the data off, then we get these kind of daily light intensity curves, right? At noon, the light's really intense, and then at night, there's not much light. And we can use that to estimate latitude and longitude. So we can estimate sunrise and sunset times, and that gives us some idea of latitude. And then we can measure solar noon relative to some standard like Greenwich Mean Time, and that gives us longitude. And we can use that to get location data. So light level geolocators are kind of older technology now, but when they emerged, it was really the only technology we had to study the movement of birds like painted buntings that only weigh about 15 grams. So we get data that kind of look like this. These are estimates of the most likely wintering locations for painted buntings in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. So if you want to know where your South Carolina painted buntings spend the winter, most of them are in South Florida. And that's really great. But we ended up with this kind of weird little anecdote that started to raise questions in our minds. We had a kind of a friend of a friend of a friend who was in Cuba doing some photojournalism on the illegal pet trade. And she found out through the grapevine that these trappers who catch songbirds had caught a painted bunting with some kind of weird little device on it. And she was able to track them down and buy the tag back and confirm that it was one of our geolocators. And the guys that were doing this trapping said that they had caught a few more birds that had those on, but they had destroyed the devices that they thought it was going to, lead the government to. So we had we knew that painted buntings were victims of the pet trade, but it started to dawn on us that if these are archival tags, so if birds are going to Cuba and they're getting caught, and they're less likely to come back, then we don't see data from birds that are going to Cuba. And so our inferences about where birds are going to spend the winter might be biased by the fact that birds are less likely to come back. Just to kind of illustrate what's happening here, if we imagine a study where we deploy these tags on 20 birds, and we want to know the proportion of birds that go to one of 3 winter regions, and we'll say that those regions, half the birds go to the left region, 0.3 go to the middle, and 0.2 go to the left, right? So that's 10 birds going there, 6 birds going there, 4 birds going there. So that's what we're trying to learn when we deploy these tags. But if the survival probability of birds in these regions is really different, so I'll use this phi symbol for survival. So you only have a 20% chance of surviving over here, whereas you have a 75% chance of surviving over here. Then what we actually see is that only 2 birds are coming back from the leftmost region, where we get 3 coming back from the other. So if we just use those tag recovery rates to estimate those transition probabilities that we want to know, we get really biased estimates, right? Half the birds are going to this left region, but only 25% of the tags we recovered in there. And it looks like birds are kind of equally split in those other regions. And that's obviously wrong. So this is kind of the problem we realized we have with this painted bunting data. If you're probably all familiar with this figure, right, of airplanes coming back in World War II with bullet holes, and you're trying to decide where to put the armor, and all the planes have bullet holes in the wings, and so you might think, oh, that's where we're supposed to put the armor, right? But the planes that are not coming back are the ones that you're worried about. So this is just sort of a classic example of survivor bias. This is some simulated data showing bias in those transition probabilities as a function of survival probability, just to show that this is a systematic problem. We underestimate transition probabilities to low survival regions, and we overestimate them to high survival. So this is a problem. Like I said, oh, I thought I fixed this. Well, just imagine these are birds. I don't know what complicated. Just to kind of illustrate mathematically what's happening. Like I said, we do a lot of statistical work, and I'm going to keep the statistics to a minimum here. But if we think about, so we got 2 tags back from this region, 3 tags back from this region, 3 tags back from this region. Where those come from is just the number of tags we deploy times the probability to go to that region times the probability to survive. Right, so that's just kind of a general equation that we can write for how many tags we expect to get back from each of these winter regions. And of course, there's going to be some stochasticity in that, so we can formulate that as more of a statistical model that allows for just some randomness in the actual number of tags we get back. I'm not going to spend any time on that. If you have questions, I can answer them, right? So we have this statistical model for our tag recoveries. The problem, of course, here is that these transition and survival probabilities are still confounded with each other, so we can't necessarily differentiate between not getting tagged back from a region because birds didn't go there versus birds go there and they have low survival. But what we started to think about is we actually do have other information on these parameters. It's just not so obvious. So if you think about those 20 birds that we originally tagged, 8 of them came back, right? So if we were just doing a capture-recapture study to estimate annual survival, the survival probability of birds from our study site would be 40%. And it turns out that 40%, we can think of that as an average of these survival probabilities. And specifically, it's a weighted average where the weights are those transition probabilities, right? So we can sort of formulate that as a mathematical model too, where that average survival probability is this weighted average of surviving in these different regions. And this was kind of the moment it clicked that we have a lot of capture-recapture data for these buntings. And if we can combine that information, then we can perhaps learn about some of these traits. So we developed this, we call it an integrated tag recovery model, where we have our geolocator recovery model, and then we have a survival model. This looks fancy. This is just a Cormack-Jolly-Sieber model, where what we're estimating is the survival probability of birds at some breeding site. And if we fit this in an integrated model, we can combine those two sources of information by telling the model that the survival probability that we're getting at this breeding site is equal to that weighted average at the other site. And it turns out when we do that, we can pretty much eliminate that bias in our transition probability. So the model can sort of tease out if a lot of birds are going to a region with low survival, then that'll pull the average survival probability of that site down. Whereas if they're not going to that site, then the average survival probability should be a little bit higher. But this is the same simulated data set, just showing that when we estimate those transition probabilities using both sources of data, we can eliminate that bias. So back to painted buntings. One more thing. The thing that's really cool about this too is not only do we get unbiased estimates of these transition probabilities, we also get estimates of the probability of surviving for birds that go to different parts of the wintering range. And when we fit this model to painted buntings, what we found, these are probabilities of surviving and coming back for birds wintering in different parts of the range. And you can see that the model estimated that for birds wintering in Cuba, survival is about 20% lower than for birds wintering elsewhere in the range. So we learned more about the system, and this actually gives us a little bit more evidence that perhaps the pet trade in Cuba is a problem. I actually just got an email from a person at Fish and Wildlife Service last week saying that they've been using this paper to help justify enforcement of migratory bird regulations for painted buntings. So a cool example of how thinking about these emerging technologies, how we observe them, and how we can use statistical methods to improve our inferences. This is all in a paper that came on ornithological applications. There we go. That's probably going to go all the way. Well, let's see if it works now. Oh, yep. So now it's gonna. Okay. How do I go back to preliminary mode?
Is that one?
Okay. Well. Okay. All right. So the next part of this talk, I want to move to another emerging technology called the MODIS tracking network. Some of you may have seen this before. Every dot on this figure is a tower. This is an example of one of these towers. It's got some Yagi antennas mounted to it. This is all part of a large collaborative network to track birds and bats and insects across North America. So several companies now make these specially coded, these are just VHF tags, but they are compatible with this network. So if you tag a bird in some spot and release it and it flies nearby one of these towers, it will record the presence of that bird and get data. So this is, of course, these are just VHF tags, so they can be extremely small. This is a technology that's emerged that people are really excited about. Just as a quick example, we've incorporated this into some of the, we teach a spring ornithology class at UGA, and we've started tagging birds with students. This is Cody Cox, who's a research professional in my lab. So these are all tracks of white-throated sparrows that we tagged in Athens last winter as part of this course. And then all of the detections of those birds as they migrated north to their boreal breeding grounds in the spring. And then a few birds have actually, it's kind of hard to tell on this map, but a few birds have actually started to pick them up on their southward fall migration. And actually 2 birds have come back and been picked up by our towers in Athens. So this is a really exciting technology. It allows us to track very small birds over very large distances, but it comes with a lot of challenges for trying to estimate survival, phenology, migration routes, and that type of thing. And I'll highlight those as I go. So MODIS, people are very excited about MODIS. If you go to like an American Ornithological Society meeting, there's entire sessions now on MODIS. That's mainly because the tags are so small, the detection and reporting is automated, and the network is growing. So we have this really large spatial scale to learn about the movement of birds. But it's also a very challenging data set. And as a community, we're only starting to sort of grapple with, okay, well, how do we actually use data from this network to learn about birds? So we have things like imperfect detection, right? You can only be detected if you fly near a tower, and if that tower detects you. As I'll talk about in just a second, the detections come in at sort of irregular intervals. So it's not like classic capture-recapture models where we go out at kind of fixed times to find an individual. We have all sorts of heterogeneity in detection among individuals across space, different types of tags, even within the same type of tag, we see heterogeneity. Tags fall off, batteries die earlier than we expect. And this array, this network of towers was never really designed for any specific purpose. To date, it's mostly just been individual researchers who say, oh, I want to use this, so I'm going to set up a tower wherever I am, or nature centers, or zoos, or high schools. And so we have this somewhat random coverage of where the towers are, which poses some sense. So I'm going to show, hopefully this animation will work, one of the best data sets we have available to sort of think about how we can use MODIS data. This is data from Kirtland's warblers, another was federally endangered bird. They winter in the Bahamas. So you're going to see when I start this animation, look down here at these towers in the Bahamas. They breed in just a very small region in Michigan. So researchers deployed this is Nathan Cooper, a colleague of mine, who deployed MODIS tags on wintering Kirtland's warblers. And when I hit play, you'll see these birds kind of get picked up by towers. One thing, these are not flight paths, right? This animation is just going to draw sort of a straight line distance between detections. So don't think this is like actually the flight paths. So this is kind of January time frame, entering late winter, and these birds are they make this overwater crossing into Georgia and South Carolina, and then go up to the breeding grounds in Michigan. So this is a really unique data set for thinking about how we analyze MODIS data, because we have so many detections. So this is, each line on this figure is one individual. They're color coded by whether they were detected during the winter during spring migration or on the breeding grounds. So this is about 100, a little over 100 individuals, and you can see we have this really dense encounter history for most of the individuals, including a lot of detections during migration, which is pretty exciting, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. We also don't, as another thing I'm going to come back to, is that we don't really have to worry too much about movement in a really explicit way, because these birds are all wintering in sort of one small area and they're breeding in one small area. For the moment, we're going to kind of forget about where they are in space, and we're just going to think about they're in the wintering grounds, they're in migration, or they're breeding. And when we do that, we can actually start to estimate survival probability for different parts of the year. Just to kind of think about what this data look like. We tag a bird, we'll call that time 0, and we have some length of time where we're studying them, and then we get detections, right? So the bird is on the wintering grounds, and maybe we get a couple of detections, then it's picked up once in spring migration, and then it arrives on the breeding grounds. And this is itself a little bit challenging if like me, you come from kind of a classic capture recapture background where we think of everything happening in discrete units of time, right? So the way we typically would think about capture recapture is we have these intervals, right, where we can encounter an individual or not, and then when we would create an encounter history, right? It's just a bunch of zeros or ones, or in this case we have multiple states, so we'll code the states 2 and 3, right? So we didn't see the individual in this interval, we did see it in this interval in the wintering state, we missed it a couple more times, we saw it in the migration state, and we could fit like a multi-state capture recapture model to this state. This has some downsides to it, right? The width of those intervals were not built into our study design, so we just kind of arbitrarily would bin it into like week or 2-week periods or 10-day periods or whatever we want. We have some computational inefficiencies because we have to loop over all these occasions where we didn't see the bird, but we still have to include that in the model. And we can also end up with these kind of tricky situations where maybe the bird got detected twice within the same interval, but in different states, right? And so in a discrete time model, we could only put the bird in one of those 2 states, and so we'd have to just pick one. We can also end up losing information because if the bird was seen twice in one interval, we just say it was detected, and so we lose some information in that. So the better way to do this would be to treat this as a continuous time process. We don't really, as ecologists, we don't do a lot of continuous time stuff, so this is a little bit foreign, including to myself until quite recently. But in a continuous time framework, what we just keep track of is how much time passed in between our detections and what state the bird was in each of those detections. And then we can fit a multi-state model, but thinking about this in a continuous time framework. Again, I won't spend too much time on the math, but if you're familiar with multi-state models, right, we have this matrix that's governing the transition from one state into another state, right? So transitioning from winter to migration or from breeding to dead. And that's governed in a discrete time model by probabilities. In a continuous time model, these are rates, right? So we think about the rate at which individuals transition, for example, from one of the live states into a dead state. We can also think about the rate at which individuals transition from, say, winter to migration or migration to breeding. You can't transition out of the dead state, right? So these all get zeros. And then any transitions that we wouldn't allow ecologically, like you can't go from migration to winter in this case, so we just set those rates equal to 0. And this gives us a framework for estimating things that we might be interested in, like season-specific survival rates and phenology of when birds are moving between the states. Now, we still have this detection issue, right? In order to actually see a bird in one of these states, we have to detect it at a tower. And the way we do that in this continuous time framework is just have another matrix where we have detection rates. Again, these are not probabilities. This is like the expected number of detections of an individual in the wintering state versus the migration state. Or in the breeding state, if you're dead, you can't be detected. And then for anybody who likes the math, we can formulate a likelihood for all of our detections, and we can estimate these parameters. So we applied this approach to the Kirtland's warbler data set. These are estimates of these daily transition probabilities, so we can convert those rates into probabilities. So we can see birds kind of starting to leave the wintering grounds and enter that spring migration state in mid-April. They're starting to arrive on the breeding ground by the 1st of May. And so we get these really sort of surprisingly precise estimates of when birds are in different stages of their annual cycle. And like I said, we also get survival probabilities or hazard rates for different periods of the annual cycle. So remember, these are hazard rates. So the higher the hazard rate, the lower the survival. And what we see here is that hazard rates are pretty low during these stationary breeding and wintering periods, and they're much, much higher during migration. That's not super surprising. We expect migration to be a risky time of the annual cycle for these birds, but actually estimating survival rates during migration has long been something we were unable to do using kind of traditional capture-recapture methods. So this is cool. Again, back to this theme of like technology, emerging technology always has problems you don't foresee that you have to solve. If you translate these into annual survival probabilities, they're way too low. So what we've sort of figured out is that we're violating some assumption in this model that's leading to sort of implausibly high hazard rates. And after a lot of banging our head up against the wall, we figured out that one of the assumptions of this model is that these detections are happening just at a constant rate, right? So if you think about what that looks like, this is our detection rate, and it's just constant over time. So these detections should be, somewhat evenly distributed, following this kind of Poisson time series. If you look at raw MODIS data, you see it's not evenly spaced at all, right? It's super clumped. So if you get one detection, you tend to get multiple detections. And then you have this long period of time where there's no detection. And boom, boom, boom. And that's because like a bird is not near a tower, and then all of a sudden it is near a tower, and so you detect it a few times, and then somewhere else, and then you detect it a few times. And so this is kind of a challenge. But we figured out there's this class of models called Cox process models, where the intensity of that process is allowed to vary as a function of the detection history. So you have sort of a baseline rate, and then you get detected, and that detection intensity jumps up for a little bit of time and then kind of fades down over time. So we figured out how to implement this, and we applied it to the Kirtland's warbler data, and we get much more reasonable survival estimates. Still much higher much higher hazard during migration, but now we get estimates that are much more in line with what we would expect annual survival for a songbird to be. And so we can show that daily hazard rates during spring migration are about 2 to 3 times higher than they are during station. Okay, so the last little bit here, we started at 11:15. So I want to end. So that's some work that part of that's published if you want to read about those continuous time models. The last bit here I want to talk about is thinking about this MODIS array from the perspective of sampling design. If you've taken a class in experimental methods, we talk a lot about designing your study in a way that is going to allow you to answer the questions you want to answer. And then now we have this network where we have no control generally of where the towers are, but we want to learn. As I mentioned, that Kirtland's warbler data is really nice because we sort of can ignore complex movement patterns. For most species, that's not the case, right? So to just show a couple of examples, this is MODIS data from a PhD student of mine who's studying Sprague's pipits in Montana. So she's tagging birds with some partners up here in the northern Great Plains. And you can see these Sprague's pipits, when they leave, they spread out over this really large area. Same thing is happening with the white-throated sparrows, right? So some white-throated sparrows are going up through Michigan, some are going to Nova Scotia. So if we want to think about how individuals are surviving. In these cases, we also need to know where they are, right? So we need to start thinking about, can we estimate movement paths and the kind of more conventional movement models from this type of data. And that turns out to be a really hard problem for all the challenges I mentioned just a minute ago. And so we've sort of started to approach this from the perspective, from both the modeling perspective, what does a movement model for MODIS data look like, but also from a study design perspective, which is to say, if we want to learn about migratory movements of Sprague's pipits, how might we design an array of towers that would best allow us to estimate those objectives? And it may look something like this, but it might not. So this is some work that Nancy Roginski, who's a PhD student in my lab, is working on as part of her thesis. So I'm showing some of her work now. The way we've approached this is through kind of a simulation-based method. So we're using Sprague's pipit as our kind of case study here. The map on the right is the relative abundance of Sprague's pipits kind of throughout the year based off of eBird maps. So we've scaled this in a way that we get sort of constant abundance, not constant abundance, but we scale it so that we can compare abundance during the breeding season with migration in winter. So you can see where they're breeding, and then they kind of follow these migration routes down, and then winter in the Chihuahuan Desert and along the Gulf Coast of Texas and Mexico. So we start with these range maps, and then we simulate the movement of birds across this landscape using this individual-based modeling package in R. So we can set this up in a way that the birds actually sort of migrate along that migration path that we know Sprague's pipits follow. So this is 500 kind of simulated migration paths of Sprague's pipits across the landscape. And then what we can do is just kind of overlay a MODIS tower array on top of that landscape. So we can put the tower, we're not constrained by any, cost or logistics here. So we can approach it from like a totally theory perspective of how many towers should we put out and how should we arrange this. So we're thinking of this from a few different perspectives. If you've been in MODIS conversations, everybody always talks about fences, right? We need to put fences across the landscape. So if you cross that latitude, you'll get picked up by a tower, right? So you can think about these fences. These are each an individual tower. And so if a bird crosses that fence, in theory, you're pretty much guaranteed to see them if your towers are close enough. But in between those fences, you have really no idea what you're doing. We could also think about like a grid pattern. We could just put them out randomly, right? Which is maybe sort of what we do now, although probably not quite. Or we could think about if Sprague's pipits were the only species we cared about, we could put them out in sort of a random way, but weighted by where Sprague's pipits are likely to be. So it's a weighted random approach. And then we can sort of look at how birds get detected by those arrays. So we say we take these simulated movement paths, and if it comes within about 15 kilometers of one of our towers, we say the bird got detected, and we can track kind of time and that sort of thing. 15 kilometers is about the range that these towers should be able to detect birds in kind of ideal conditions. So Nancy's doing this kind of really large scale simulation where we vary our towers and the number of towers, and then we look at how our detections change across these different designs. So we can have, I didn't show, we have 100 towers, 200, 400, 800 in these different ways, right? So if you're studying Sprague's pipits, like this is probably going to do really well, right? Like 800 towers that are only where you want them to be. But we can compare these. Right now, we are just sort of comparing these using some simple summary statistics, like the mean number of detections per bird, right? So, these are the different tower arrays, the different number of towers. So you can see that weighted, that kind of random abundance approach always detects more birds than the other scenarios, which kind of makes sense, right? Like we're putting the towers where the Sprague's pipits are. So we get a lot more detections, and those increase as the density of towers increases. what was a little bit surprising is that those other array designs don't seem to be super different from each other in terms of just the mean number of detections. We also thought about things like what proportion of individuals get detected, 3 or more times. If we're thinking about movement modeling, then one detection doesn't do us much good. We need multiple detections of each individual. So you can see at low densities of towers, again, that weighted random design does really well. By the time we get up to about 400 towers, there's not much difference between any of these array designs at all. And then we also were quantifying the mean distance between detections. So what's kind of the spatial resolution of your detections, which would be useful for modeling movement paths. Again, this kind of random weighted abundance approach works best, and not a lot of difference among the evidence. So we're just starting to use this to kind of explore how we could think about MODIS from a study design perspective. The other thing that Nancy is just starting to work on is trying to fit movement paths to the data, so fit really simple movement models. You can kind of start to see how these designs might differ, right? With a fence design, like we said, you have no idea where the bird was in between these detections, so you kind of totally miss this little jog to the west that this bird took. Whereas when you're weighting by abundance, you're much more likely to kind of pick up those more sinuous movement paths, and that tends to be pretty consistent. Although again, once you start to get into really large densities of towers, you start to pick up movement paths in quite a bit of so this is something that hopefully, to check back in a year, we'll have a lot more results to show from this. What we're starting to think about right now is not just thinking about these kind of simple summary statistics, but actually what do the models need to look like, and how well can we estimate the parameters we're interested in under these different designs, right? So if we fit these movement and survival models to the simulated data sets, how is bias and precision of these parameters that we're interested in influenced by different designs? As I mentioned, the hard part with MODIS data is that it doesn't fit nicely into kind of existing capture, recapture, or movement modeling analysis framework. So we have to deal with these continuous time observations. We have spatial variability in where the receivers are. We have different behavioral states, right? Is a bird migrating, or is it at a stopover site? There's location uncertainty, right? Just because a tower detects a bird, if you have a 15-kilometer radius detection range, that's a pretty big area where the bird could have been. That ideally we would be able to address. We have birds dying, right? So if you're fitting a movement model and you don't see a bird, is that because it went somewhere where there were no towers, or is that because the bird died? We would need to figure out how to differentiate between those. As I mentioned, tags fall off all the time. I've seen a lot of talks, people trying to estimate survival from MODIS data, and almost always the survival rates are too low. There's a lot of reasons that is, but part of it's just like, they have these telemetry tags have long, fragile antennas, and 6 months later, that antenna may have fallen off, right? And that's a critical assumption of capture recapture models, that there's no tag loss, and we may have, pretty substantial rates of tag loss that we have to figure out how to deal with if we want to get the most out of these data, and tons of individual heterogeneity driven by a lot of different sources. So these are all, if you're a quantitative person and you like capture recapture type data, MODIS, I think, is this really fun emerging challenge where, all of these different, if you look through the capture recapture literature, there's examples of models that can deal with each one of these problems, right? None of these are new to capture recapture, but MODIS combines them in sort of a unique way, right? So how do you address multiple ones of these issues within an analytical framework? I think it's a fun challenge. So, if this is your kind of thing, then let's talk. We also have this kind of optimal design problem in this, which is that the design depends on the modeling objective, right? You can't really think about study design without thinking about what you're trying to do. Are we trying to estimate movement? Are we trying to estimate survival? Are we trying to estimate both at the same time? So the right tower design is going to look slightly different, probably, depending on what we're trying to do. We've also started to approach this from a slightly different set of, all the figures I showed before were like, let's just put towers wherever we want. In talking to some of our partners, the question that's emerged is, well, we already have a bunch of towers on the landscape. So if you're an organization like a state agency or Fish and Wildlife Service who wants to fund a MODIS project, the question isn't like, should I put out my towers in a grid or a fence? It's, I've got this current landscape of towers and I want to put 20 more towers somewhere. Where should those towers go? And that's kind of a slightly different optimization problem, right? Because there's a whole lot of different places those towers could go. And so you've got to think about, okay, how does the additional information you get from a tower at this location differ from adding the tower at this location? And that could mean fitting a whole bunch of different models, which would be very time consuming. So one of the things we're starting to explore is the use of these recursive Bayesian methods that kind of take advantage of Bayes' theorem to update models without having to rerun every single model for every single simulation, and save a lot of time. So you can go from the example in this paper, they have some optimization problem that would have taken like 150,000 computer hours or something like that to optimize, and they were able to do it in like 2 hours using these features. So check back in like a year and hopefully. So just to kind of wrap up the talk, so we have all sorts of new technology. If you study small species, you probably encountered all sorts of new technologies that you're really excited about. Those open the door for a lot of questions that we've been trying to ask for a long time, but haven't been able to answer. If you've taken one thing away from this talk, I hope it's that you have to think really hard about how the ecological processes that you're trying to learn about interact with the way that those technologies observe those processes, right? And oftentimes it's quite complicated, and there's subtle ways that the technology might lead you astray if you're not thinking about that. And so if you're a grad student kind of thinking about where you want to go and what you want to do, when I look out at kind of the field of wildlife ecology and population ecology, the things that are really exciting are where people are thinking about these new technologies and these new statistical tools and how they can be combined in new ways to address these questions. So take your math classes, take your statistics classes, it'll pay off big time. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
I found the bit about the continuous time models really interesting. I'm not familiar with those, but I'm curious, is that something that's sort of new and just being used for birds, or is it?
I think it's new for ecologists.
Okay.
I think it's grown in the literature a lot as movement ecology has grown, because a lot of movement data is coming in continuous time. But if I can go back, this Journal of Applied Ecology citation that I included. Basically, we had this Kirtland's warbler data set, and we realized that we probably needed to use continuous time. And I personally found the literature to be like almost impossible to wade through. So I spent like months and months of time trying to figure out how to do this. And this paper was my attempt to be like, if nothing else comes of that effort, I want just like a paper that's about like, how do you fit continuous time models? So this paper is written as a like, here's conceptually how these models work, and it's got a lot of appendices with other stuff. But I think that's important, because if you sort of think about the technologies that we use now, like camera trapping data, hit tagging, ARU data, like almost everything is kind of moving towards continuous detection and reporting. And so I think my prediction is that we're going to kind of see a shift in the way we train graduate students to think about statistical modeling to include more continuous.
Yeah, I think it's super cool, and I can see applications with citizen science data where you're getting reports on animals seen at, all kinds of random times. So
Yeah. Yeah.
So for these like big gaps between detections, why can't you just assume that they, like, why can't you just draw the line and if it crosses towers, can you just assume that they crossed that space?
You know, I think it goes back a little bit to like what you're trying to estimate. I think if you were trying to estimate survival, like if you just wanted to know, if we tag a pipit in Montana, and it spends like kind of currently for example, spends a little time in Montana and then it migrates south and it comes down here to wintering grounds. A fence design might be really effective, right? Because you have if your towers are spaced pretty close together, you have a pretty good chance of knowing if the bird made it to here, made it to here, made it to here. But if you're trying to estimate movement, then that doesn't work as well, right? Because you have all these gaps in between where, again, maybe during migration, birds are kind of following a straight line, but oftentimes they're not, right? They're being blown by wind, by weather conditions, trying to find stopover habitat. Like there's a great example, Swainson's thrush are really famous for like migrating up through the Great Lakes and then veering off to, British Columbia, right? So like if you just detected them in the winter and the breeding, you'd think they'd probably cut across the western US, but that's not it.
I have a second question that's not related to that, where I know it looks random the way they put these towers out, but I'm just curious. I do my field work out on the coast, and I know people put them up like specifically for painted bunting. So like, how much bias is there on like the communities that are putting them out and what species they're putting them out for?
Yeah, I think that's I think that's a really good point, because like this might look random, but it's not random in like kind of subtle ways, right? Because a lot of these towers, this is these are our towers in Athens, right? Like we work in Athens, so that's why we set them up. A lot of the coastal towers are set up for shorebirds, right? So there's a lot of these towers are set up to detect red knots and whimbrels and species like that, because South Carolina and Georgia are really interested in those. And right, so like those aren't random in any sense. Now, from somebody who studies painted buntings, maybe those are kind of random because they're not set up to study painted buntings. But I do think there's this like kind of subtle non-randomness to where the towers go up that is probably impacting our inference in pretty complicated ways. I will say what's happening in MODIS now is that these regional working groups. So there's like a Southeastern working group, a Northeastern working group, Great Lakes, who are trying to think about at a regional scale, where should towers go? So we are starting to see some coordination across states and across regions about, should we put up fences? You can kind of see, right? I talked about fences, right? Like South Carolina has, I think, sort of taken like a fence approach, right? There's Pennsylvania, so it gets kind of lost here, but there's a fence. So some of these working groups have just been sort of like, we're just going to set up fences across our state, which may be good, but again, it kind of depends on what.
There might be a question.
I've got a question. If you all can hear me, I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Rob, can you say something?
Yeah. Okay, I've got a question.
Oh, sorry,
All right.
I didn't realize I was speaking.
If you all can hear it. So it's a very similar problem to the way land trusts have. Great talk, by the way. Thank you.
It might not be able to.
No, it's not working, is it? Okay, so they can
We
hear.
can't hear you in the classroom.
The speaker on the computer is. There we go.
Can you hear it now? Can you hear it now? All right.
There you go. All right,
Okay.
here now. We should be able to hear you now.
All right. How about that?
Yeah. Yep.
Gotcha.
Okay. So really nice talk. Thank you. This distribution of towers struck me as really similar to the problem in conservation planning with the way land trusts, for example, have established new easements and stuff like this on their own, just to sort of satisfy their local interests. But then all these regional conservation plans are pointing sort of to more optimal areas in the landscape and trying to get them to look at these plans and say, well, maybe we should optimize our distribution of new conservation lands. I wonder if you've thought about using that software like Marxand, that you could incorporate your existing points. I'm sure you have thought about this, and sort of lock them in and then build a more optimal landscape on top of that.
Yeah, we haven't thought about Marxand specifically, but I think that last point, we were sort of talking about this with some Fish and Wildlife Service is interested in MODIS for studying ducks. They put a huge amount of effort into banding ducks every year. And so they're sort of thinking about, well, would our money be better spent less band and band recovery and more MODIS? And so they're obviously thinking about this at a much larger scale than like state agencies or individual researchers would be thinking about it. And they were the ones who sort of said, well, let's not think about this as we're starting from scratch and should we have a grid or fences. Like we already have a bunch of towers, so if we want to find 100 towers, where should those go to complement the existing network? And so that is something we're starting to move towards, using that recursive Bayesian method where the way that works is you sort of estimate something you want to estimate given the current towers, and you get like a posterior distribution of where whatever state variable you're interested in, survival or something like that. And then you put 50 towers on the landscape and you sort of update your posterior after without refitting the model and see, okay, how do these 50 locations differ in terms of their information quality relative to different 50 locations. So you can do that thousands and thousands of times without having to refit these, time-consuming Bayesian models. So that's kind of where we're moving. But I think that's a good point. It's very similar to kind of that land management perspective of how do you complement what's already there and not necessarily start from scratch.
Yeah, it might be a fun thing to try just because you can lock in those existing sites.
Yeah.
That way, but I think your method sounds probably a little more transparent, probably.
Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Well, we're running out of time, so let's thank Dr. Rushing one more time. For those that signed up, I believe they're at your lunch. I don't know.